Hello and welcome to our afternoon edition of Arirang News, coming to you live from Seoul. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kwon Jang-ho. Washington slapped its second round of sanctions on Iran, returning them to their full level before the 2015 nuclear deal. But South Korea is breathing a sigh of relief, as it's one of 8 countries that have been granted a temporary waiver to continue importing Iranian oil. We'll be looking at this in more detail later in the show, but first we turn to our news centre, where Devin Whiting updates us with the day's other top stories. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. First up, North Korea. Its negotiations with the U.S. have been stalled for months, but this Friday it looks like the North Korean leader's top aide, Yong-chol, will be sitting down in New York with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Oh Jung-hee has the latest.
Some 5 months after the Singapore summit, North Korea and the United States are finally due to hold high-level talks. The U.S. State Department says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol, the head of Pyongyang's United Front Department, the intelligence agency, will meet in New York on Thursday to discuss denuclearization and the implementation of the June 12th summit declaration. It's expected the steps North Korea promised to take to denuclearize and U.S. actions in return will top the agenda. Meeting with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un promised to invite international experts to oversee the permanent dismantlement of its Dongchangri missile engine test site. Kim Jong-un also expressed the willingness to also scrap the Yongbyon nuclear test site for good if Washington takes corresponding measures. The tug-of-war continued for the past couple of months on what those corresponding measures should be and whether U.S. should actually take those actions. Pyongyang first called for an end to the Korean War and has now shifted its focus to lifting sanctions, but the U.S. is firm that sanctions will remain in place until North Korea denuclearizes. And Pompeo has recently reconfirmed that denuclearization ends when the U.S. verifies it. With the high-level talks now set in stone, it's also expected that these talks could involve figures who are to lead the working-level talks as well. The State Department announced that Stephen Biegun, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, is taking part. And according to Tokyo-based Kyodo News Agency, the U.S. has asked Choi Sun-hee, the North's Vice Foreign Minister, to be present as well. They were supposed to meet much earlier upon a U.S. suggestion in September, but that fell flat as North Korea did not respond. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Military officials from the 2 Koreas and United Nations Command are holding talks today about plans for the joint security area. That includes eventually allowing visitors to the JSA to cross freely over the border. According to Seoul's Defense Ministry, the 3-way talks began at around 10 a.m. at the Freedom House on the South Korean side of the border village of Panmunjom. The 3 sides are assessing the removal of weapons from the JSA, which took place in late October. They're also expected to talk about plans for the South and North to each station security personnel on the other side, also installing surveillance equipment there and sharing information. The Japanese government said last week that it cannot accept the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling that a Japanese company has to pay compensation to Koreans forced to work for it during World War II. Now lawyers and scholars from Japan are saying Tokyo's stance is unhelpful and that forced labor is an issue of human rights. Sobol Bin has the details.
Over 100 Japanese lawyers and scholars have issued a statement criticizing the Japanese government's response to the South Korean Supreme Court's decision on the compensation for forced labor. Attorneys Shiro Kawakami and Seita Yamamoto announced on Tuesday a joint statement together with 100 other lawyers and scholars at the Tokyo House of Councilors, stating that the issue of compensation for victims of forced labor is a human rights issue, and any agreement that doesn't satisfy the victims or nations involved is not a helpful solution. The statement also said that individual rights to claim under the Korea-Japan Jurisdiction Agreement have not been terminated, and that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's claim that individuals' rights to compensation had been completely resolved is misleading. It also said Japanese companies that are sued in South Korea over the issue should provide more support for the victims. But Japanese Congressman Yasuhisa Shiozaki, who visited Korea's National Assembly, said he cannot accept the decision since it involves overturning the legal basis of the relationship between Korea and Japan and said this Seoul should correct what he says is a violation of international law. 서보빈, Arirang News.
The United States and China will hold the latest round of their diplomatic and security dialogue on Friday in Washington. The U.S. State Department said Monday that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary James Mattis will represent Washington, while high-ranking Chinese Politburo member Yang Jiechi and Defense Minister Wei Fenghe will represent Beijing. This second round of talks was originally supposed to happen in Beijing in October, but it was postponed because of rising tensions over trade and the South China Sea. The first round was held in June of last year in Washington. Tens of millions of Americans will be casting ballots Tuesday in the 2018 midterm elections. The outcome is far from clear, judging from the polls. But our Park Hee-jun takes a look at how the election could affect the Trump administration's policy on North Korea.
These midterm elections in the U.S. are particularly important for the Korean Peninsula, as the outcome is directly linked to the future direction of nuclear negotiations with North Korea. Right after the elections, North Korea and the U.S. will hold high-level talks to make progress on the North's denuclearization and sort out the details of a second summit between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump planned for early next year. So the midterms are of immediate concern for the Korean Peninsula. There are 4 possible scenarios, but the latest poll suggests the most probable one is where Republicans maintain control of the Senate and Democrats win back the House. According to one expert for South Korea, that outcome would complicate the ongoing peace drive, including inter-Korean cooperation projects. The Trump administration will lose some of its political clout to push through the president's plans to engage the North.
I think the human rights issue will be raised by the Democrats, and also more pressure on North Korea will be raised by Democrats in the Congress, which is contradictory to the President Trump's policy, which is negotiation. So all in all, I think President Trump will be, kind of isolated positions by Congress as far as the North Korea policy is concerned.
And so there may be a change of pace, but a different expert doesn't expect much to change from the status quo, even if Democrats regain control of Congress.
Obviously, from next year going on, the United States is going to go into election period in the second half of the year. So probably leading up to that point, the first half, we might see a little stalemate and postponing everything, every process, and try to keep everything under control and manageable.
President Trump will have to seek support from Democrats for a successful outcome with North Korea, but ultimately it comes down to President Trump's response, whether he will push for dialogue with the regime and its denuclearization as he has up until this point. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
In other news, South Korea's trade figures came in pretty strong for September. The nation's current account surplus, a very broad measure of trade, was over $10 billion for the first time in a year. And in goods and services, there was a trade surplus for the 79th month in a row. That's over 6.5 years running. According to the Bank of Korea, the surplus was $10.83 billion, the highest since the previous September. The surplus in goods was also the highest in a year, even though the nation's exports and imports were both lower because of a major local holiday. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
The US has now restored all sanctions on Iran to where they were before the 2015 nuclear deal, as promised by President Trump. But 8 countries, including South Korea, China and India, have been granted temporary waivers, which means that, for now, those countries are free to import oil from Iran without fear of economic repercussions from Washington. We'll look at the implications of these developments after our Foreign Ministry correspondent, Lee Ji-won, tells us more about the US announcement.
With the 180-day grace period coming to an end on Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin announced the return of U.S. sanctions on Iran.
We are making it abundantly clear to the Iranian regime that they will face mounting financial isolation until they fundamentally change their destabilizing behavior. These powerful sanctions directly target Iran's banking, energy, and shipping sectors.
Pompeo said 8 countries would be granted waivers from the sanctions as they had significantly reduced their purchases of Iranian crude over the past 6 months.
We have decided to issue temporary allotments to a handful of countries, responsive both to the specific circumstances and to ensure a well-supplied oil market. The U.S. will be granting these exemptions to China, India, Italy, Greece, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey.
The waivers will last up to 180 days, but are extendable. Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry says the decision means South Korea will be able to maintain a stable supply level of Iranian condensate or ultralight oil, but exact figures were not disclosed. South Korea heavily depends on Iranian oil. An official at the ministry said over half of the country's daily imports of condensate barrels last year were from Iran. Seoul is also free to maintain its current financial transactions with Iran's sanctioned central bank. The two countries have been trading oil and other products by paying and receiving Korean won through the Iranian central bank's accounts at 2 South Korean banks. Since South Korea's currency has low convertibility, the official said, the negotiating team assured the U.S. that this method of transaction will not allow U.S. dollars or other foreign currencies to flow into Iran. The U.S. sanctions on Tehran comes as the Trump administration withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran in May, saying it had not stopped Iran from developing its ballistic missile program and intervening in neighboring countries. While Pompeo said more than 20 importing nations have already zeroed out their imports of Iranian crude, he warned the U.S. will continue negotiations to get all of the nations to zero. 이지원, Arirang News.
For more, in the studio with us today is Dr Will Jeong, a research fellow from the Sejong Institute. It's good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me today.
So the full U.S. sanctions on Iran are back. This has been one of the key objectives for the Trump administration and it has been finally followed through. How significant are these new sanctions?
So the Trump administration has emphasized that the Iran nuclear deal made during the Obama administration is a bad one. Not only because that Iran is not really complying with the nuclear deal, but also Iran has not changed its behavior toward the United States. So Secretary Pompeo today during the presser mentioned that Iran still poses the threat to United States and is still sponsoring the terrorism. So that is why United States has to restore all the sanctions imposed before 2015. So they now have full sanctions on export of oil and the banking and the shipping and shipbuilding areas, which will be believed to be huge impact on Iranian economy.
For South Korea and 7 other countries that have been granted waivers, this is quite a relief that have been given this exemption to keep importing Iranian oil. Now, the reasons given were said to have because of specific circumstances. That's what Pompeo said, to ensure well-supplied oil market. How much of a relief is this for South Korea and these other countries that this waiver has been granted?
So South Korean government, as well as many other governments, has tried to adapt the new environment imposed by the United States. Because South Korean dependency on Iranian oil was huge, that even though South Korean government has tried to reduce its dependency on Iranian oil, but there's still it has a difficult to diversify its oil importing sources. So that is why South Korean government tried to negotiate with the United States to get the waiver this time. And South Korea and 8 other countries, including China, Turkey, Taiwan, and Japan, get the exemption this time. However, it's not like permanent exemption, so it has a 180-day period. And after 180 days, United States can extend the exemption, or those countries should be cutting the import from the Iranian. So I think that this is a relief that we can have a stable supply from the Iran. But the problem is that it's not permanent. So we still have to reduce the amount of oil that we are importing from Iran.
So yes, you've mentioned that it's only temporary, but then looking ahead then, so what does this look for, what does it look like ahead in the long term for South Korea? Is this good news or is this bad news going for the long term as well, especially as oil prices could change now that these sanctions have come in?
So first thing that hit the market would be the uncertainty that imposed by these sanctions and sanction relief and restoring the sanctions. So the biggest problem for the market is not the sanction itself, but the uncertainty that these sanction measures are brought into the market. So now with the sanctions, that supply of the oil from Iran is limited. That means that other countries' oil supply will increase the oil price. That means that oil industry will adapt to the new higher oil prices. That means that our shipbuilding industries and our ocean plant industries will have much more opportunity than before. But the problem is that the shipbuilding industries and the ocean plant industries have very long-term investment period. That means that the investment decision cannot be made overnight. So if there's any uncertainties about these issues, then there's going to be less opportunity for the investment, which is not good for the Korean industries in shipbuilding and ocean plant. So that is why many people argue that these sanctions and the change in oil prices has very uncertain impact on Korean economy.
So we'll have to see how those plans out, those uncertainties. But for those who are interested in South Korean and North Korean affairs, the timing of this announcement comes at an interesting time because it's just days before the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sits down with North Korean officials to hash out further deals with North Korea as well. Now, do you think these new sanctions on Iran sends a particular message to Pyongyang as well?
I consider that the timing of announcement of the restoration of the sanctions on Iran and the announcement of Secretary Pompeo's meeting with Kim Yong-chol is like coincidence because United States has this 180 days period since May that they have to announce something on that day. And also there's Secretary Pompeo has mentioned before that he's going to meet his counterpart, Vice Chairman Kim Yong-chol, at the end of this week. However, the restoration of the sanctions on Iran sent a message to North Korea because that U.S. government is very sensitive on the sanction issues because sanction and pressure will change when United States believe that the sanctions and the diplomatic pressure would change Iran's behavior toward the United States. The same thing can be applied to U.S. belief on North Korea. So President Trump has mentioned repeatedly that he has not given anything to North Korea by quoting that he's not easing any sanctions on North Korea. So I think that the announcement of the restoration of sanctions actually sent a message to North Korea that United States is not going to change its policy unless North Korea is changing its attitude toward North Korea and its nuclear weapons.
You could say North Korea already gave their reply to these sanctions back in August after the first round of sanctions on Iran were reimposed. Now, a day after that first round of sanctions was announced, North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-chol was in Iran meeting with the Iranian president, criticizing Washington's recent actions. Do you expect any further kind of similar pushback from North Korea after these announcements as well?
So recent days, not only North Korean officials, but North Korean government-controlled media published a couple of articles criticizing U.S. on its sanctions onto North Korea. So since October, the North Korea changed its tone that before October, North Korea demanded the trust building between North Korea and the United States. So they argue something like a declaration to end the war. But since October, they changed it to more emphasizing the easing the sanctions as for building trust between two countries. So I think that that's why the talks between two countries are not moving forward, because now North Korea is demanding the easing the sanctions as the condition of continuing talks with the United States. So I think the North Korea's position is to get lift of sanctions or ease of the sanctions at the exchange of denuclearization talk with the United States. And the U.S. is not ready to accept that kind of deals yet, because U.S. government believes that the pressing North Korea with the economic sanctions is the only way to lead the North Korea into the denuclearization. So we have to see what kind of statement are going to be delivered after Pompeo Kim Yong-chol meeting in New York.
One final interesting point about the Pompeo-Kim Yong-chol meeting as well. Japanese media outlet Kyodo News has reported that along with Kim Yong-chol will be coming Choi Sun-hee, who is the direct counterpart for Stephen Biegun, which is the US Special Representative for North Korea. Now that's interesting because when those two meet, hopefully the thinking is that they will discuss the details about denuclearization, which is what the US wants. If this does turn out to be the case, does it suggest that it's a good sign that North Korea perhaps might be willing to make some sort of deal towards a denuclearization, a bit more at least?
If Choi Sun-hee indeed moves trip with Kim Yong-chol to New York, then probably she's going to meet her counterpart, Mr. Steve Biegun, in New York. But if it's a separate meeting, then I would give more weight on the meetings. But this time, their presence in New York is not for the working level talks on denuclearization, but rather they just accompany their bosses. So I think that if they come up with future meeting plans, that working level negotiations will begin on a certain date at a certain location, then we could see that there was some progress. But if they just be there to accompany their bosses, then we probably can end up concluding that there's not much progress this time. So we have to see whether Secretary Pompeo and Vice Chairman Kim Yong-chol to agree to announce the date and the location of the second Trump-Kim summit. So if they don't reach the agreement, then probably there was a problem in negotiation with regard to the nuclear weapons.
Okay, so meanwhile, inter-Korean cooperative projects continue. So we're going to shift focus there just before we go. And we're going to try and fit in as many of these as we can before you go, because there's been quite a busy few days in Korea, on the Korean peninsula. So on yesterday, the two Koreas held joint inspections of the estuaries of the Hangang River and the Imjingang River, which are on the border of the two Koreas. Now, what is this project about, and why is this project important to the two Koreas?
So symbolically, it's very historically meaningful, because the estuaries of Hangang is very sensitive in military purposes for South Korea, because it's right into the metropolitan area of Seoul. So defending that area is very critical for the defense of South Korea. And having joint project with the North Korea is in that regard very important in the history. And at the same time that two Koreas doing this kind of project to get ocean aggregate and other fisheries, or the safe passage of civilian ships, which is important in expanding the scope of cooperation between two Koreas. However, there's certain caveats that if they develop the ocean aggregate, then if South Korea government pay for those aggregate to North Koreans, it could violate the UN sanctions. So there are certain areas that two government has to be very careful not to violate any sanctions.
And I think we can fit in one more. Another set of talks that were announced on Monday as well was that the two Koreas are set to hold a joint health projects talks on Wednesday as well. Now, those will be the first time those talks will be held in 11 years as well. Now, what are the agenda for those talks? And again, there's also the concern about UN sanctions as well there, isn't there?
So the health talks this time is about to establish joint measures on the infectious diseases that can happen on the border. So now there are problems of like infectious disease in North Korea, which is caused by the less availability of the vaccines in North Korea. So by having this kind of talks, then North Korea probably expect that there could be more humanitarian aid on the medicines, including vaccines. So there has been international efforts to deliver more vaccines to North Korea. However, because of the sanctions, that it has been some of the project of delivering vaccines were blocked by the UN and the United States. So I think that as long as US is very reluctant to agree on delivering those vaccines to North Korea, then unilateral move by South Korean government can cause some problems with the US government. So I think it's a good thing that we have this kind of talks for the humanitarian purpose and to have joint measures against the infectious diseases, but at the same time, as UN sanction is still continuing, that we have to consider not to violate it.
Right, we're out of time, so that's where we'll wrap it up. Thank you for coming in as usual and sharing us your insights.
Thank you.
And that's where we'll conclude our show. I'll be back again tomorrow to bring you more analysis of the day's top headlines. In the meantime, hope you have a good day and thank you for watching. Goodbye.
'18 Overseas TV Audience Survey.